too.
So I think we will begin now. So, Renato, if you would like to give us a word or two of introduction, and then we'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Good morning, everyone. Bom dia a todos. Bom, pessoal, é um prazer estar com todos vocês aqui nessas aulas, né, que eu considero assim que é um marco para a nossa faculdade. Assim, primeira vez que nós temos assim a oportunidade de ter uma aula online, né, síncrona, com um professor internacional, um professor da categoria do Michael Gorman, e tudo isso patrocinado pela professora Stamp e a equipe dela, né? A professora Stamp é uma referência mundial, né, em São Tomás de Aquino. Então, realmente é um privilégio enorme que a gente tem de estar aqui. Então, o professor Gorman deu as 4 aulas, essa é a 4ª aula, né? A primeira foi sobre substância, depois sobre universais, a terceira tratando da modalidade, e hoje nós vamos ver a respeito de Deus, né? Então, agradeço muito a vocês todos, né, que estão aqui, né, mostra o bom nível da faculdade. Eu sabia que nossos alunos tinham esse nível, convivo com vocês nas classes, né, mas ver aqui vocês interagindo dessa maneira com esses professores, as perguntas, o nível da discussão, enche de alegria, enche de orgulho mesmo. Tanto a professora Stamp como o professor Gorman se referiram a isso, né, como ficaram bem impressionados, né? Então, acho que é uma conquista de todos nós, né? Realmente está construindo uma coisa que veio para ficar e vai fazer um bem enorme, né? Não só para nós, mas para muita gente que vai vir depois. Pessoal, nós vamos mandar depois uma carta para a professora Stamp, para o professor Gorman, para os assistentes deles, agradecendo em nome de toda a faculdade, né? Essa gentileza deles, né? A generosidade, foi uma oferta que eles fizeram, então realmente, né, nem nós fomos procurar, eles se ofereceram, e vocês vejam que coisa boa, né? Então, tá aí o link que colocaram dos vídeos, né, que já das aulas que eu ouvi antes. Essa aula de hoje também vai entrar ali, o link do Ineshan Scholars Corps, né, que tem muita coisa excelente ali, né? Então, também vocês poderem divulgar à vontade. Tá bom? Peço, como ela solicita, que todo mundo, se puder, deixar o vídeo, né, aberto para que o professor Gorman possa ver. Tá bom? Professor Stamp, Professor Gorman, thank you very much. No, it's our last meeting, and we're gonna send you a letter from our faculty. To thank for everything, no, your kindness, your generosity. But for me, it was amazing, enriching experience. Thank you very much, no, for everything. Okay, and now, Professor Gorman, thank you, no, for our class. No, excellent. No, we are learning a lot. No, thank you very much for everybody involved.
I would like to add my thanks to you, Michael, for this. I will send you separate thanks when this is over. And thank you, Renato, always for your cheerful and generous remarks. They're wonderful. Thank all your participants as well, who do your university great credit with their excellent questions, for sure. So with that, we will turn it over to you, Michael. I'm looking forward to this.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. And here we go for the last day. But let me express my thanks too to everyone who organized it, and for all of you for coming and for making it so fun and interesting with your attention and your questions. Okay, so this is the 4th lecture and the final lecture, and I'm going to be talking about questions having to do with God and how God plays a role in metaphysics in a Thomistic point of view. Now, there are some questions, well, there are a lot of questions that are related to this that I won't really be talking about. So, for example, there's an interesting, somewhat technical question about whether God is part of the subject matter of metaphysics. Some people say yes, and some people say, well, not actually. God is the cause of the subject matter of metaphysics. And since God is the cause of this, because the subject matter of metaphysics is being, but that turns out to mean something like created being. So God is the cause of that. So you have to talk about God in metaphysics as the cause of the subject matter, but God is not himself a part of the subject matter. So that's a sort of very technical, somewhat arcane question. I'm not going to talk about things like that, although they're interesting. And the medievals cared about this kind of thing, even if it's sometimes hard for us to. Hold on, I'm switching. Okay. Boom. What I'm going to talk about instead is something about what God is like for Thomas Aquinas and how that relates to some of the questions that we have been exploring in metaphysics. So the first section, I'm simply going to state that, as I explained in the outline that I sent out earlier, I'm going to be sidestepping arguments for God's existence. I'm not going to be talking about them very much. A little bit later, I will mention them, but I'm not going to go through them in detail and try to figure out exactly what the argument is and how effective the arguments are. Aquinas has a number of different arguments for God's existence. Usually what one thinks of right away is the famous 5 ways from very early in the Summa Theologiae. Some of those arguments can be found elsewhere in his writings in a somewhat different form. And you can decide for yourself whether they are different arguments or the same or a different version of the same argument. And then there are additional arguments that he makes that are not found in among the 5 ways at all. So he has a lot of different ways of approaching this. It gets very complicated, and it would be easy to have an entire lecture just on one of those arguments. So that's kind of why I don't even want to start. Where I want to start is somewhere else. I think that Aquinas's, although his arguments all take different paths, they all, or mostly all, arrive at not exactly the same conclusion, but they all arrive at a basic understanding of God, a basic idea of what God is, of what it means to be God. And that's what I want to focus on. Okay, so now I'm switching already to the second section. The basic idea, so God is an unsourced source. So I think that's a way of putting this Thomistic idea of God. God is a source of everything else, and God is unsourced. God doesn't come from anything, something like that. Okay, so let me take these in pieces. The first is that God is the source of everything other than God. Whatever exists, except for God, comes from God, according to Aquinas. And it comes from God in every respect, in every detail, in every way. And Aquinas actually spends a lot of time spelling this out because it's quite common to think differently. So, for example, someone could say that God created the universe, and then at that point, God said, I'm done. The universe is there. I've created a lot of causal agents. You guys go ahead and do your work. I'm finished here. And that would make God the creator. But for Aquinas, that would not be an adequate account of the sense in which everything comes from God, because that would mean that all of the future only sort of came from God. Other views that this is partly because he is exposed to certain traditions in philosophy, like the Neoplatonic tradition, where the sort of top being, the one, creates the next being, and then the next being creates the next being. You see, so God only gets it started. But also, I think it's important to remember that this also differentiates Aquinas' view of God from Aristotle's. Now, I've mentioned this before. Aquinas draws on Aristotle a lot, and that was very important for his thinking. But first of all, he doesn't only draw on Aristotle. And second of all, he is not afraid to disagree with Aristotle when he thinks he needs to. And you could argue perhaps, if you try, I don't know whether you could do this. You could try to make a list of philosophical theses. I don't know how you would count them. I'm not really convinced this is possible, but if you did it somehow, it could be that Aquinas agrees with a larger number of Aristotelian theses than, say, with Plotinian theses. That might be true. But some of the ways in which Aquinas disagrees with Aristotle are extremely important. They're enormous. And so just because he agrees with Aristotle a lot doesn't mean he doesn't also disagree with him in some deep ways. And one of those ways has to do with what I'm talking about right now. For Aristotle, it's not really true that God is the source of everything other than God. For Aristotle, the whole universe, the cosmos, it's here. It's always been here. I don't think for Aristotle it's really possible for it not to be here, although I'm not sure he ever really asks himself that question. And the best part of that universe is God. Rocks are part of the universe. Squirrels are part of the universe. Humans are part of the universe. And God is part of the universe. And God is the best part of the universe. Sometimes he talks about it as if there are a few dozen gods. That sounds silly, but it isn't, because he thinks that it has to do with the motions of the heavens. And it's unclear how many independent, irreducible motions of the heavens. So it's, in a sense, unclear how many gods there are. It's a sort of a technical problem. But Aristotle does seem to make it clear there's like a top god, the first god, or the first mover. Okay. Nonetheless, that first mover, that top god, is not the source of everything else. God, for Aristotle, is responsible for all the movement and change in the universe, but not for the existence of the universe. So this is a way, you could call it small if you wanted, but it's not small, it's enormous. For Aquinas, if it weren't for God's free choice to create the rest of the universe, it wouldn't be here at all. It just wouldn't be here. So God is the source of everything else for Aquinas, the source of everything in every way, in every respect. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing, the thing that goes with it, side by side, hand in hand, pari passu, God is unsourced. God has no source. God doesn't receive anything from anyone or from anything at all, ever, in any way. Nothing, for Aquinas, is prior to God in any respect. Now, it's easy to say these things, but it's actually hard to understand them. And in a funny way, it's hard to believe them, even if you're convinced they're true, because whenever we think about something, we always imagine it as if it were not merely a source, but also receiving from some prior source. But you have to work really hard to get that out of your mind if you want to understand what Aquinas thinks God is like. So God is the source of everything else, but is himself not sourced. He doesn't come from anywhere. All right. Now, I said at the outset that I did not want to discuss Aquinas's arguments for God's existence, and that's still true. But I do want to mention how at least some of his arguments fit in with what I just said about God being an unsourced source. So I'm just going to quickly go through the famous 5 ways, and some of them a little bit better than others display this idea that I've been trying to set out. So the first one is the one that the argument from motion, as people say, which, maybe we should call it the argument from change. Motion is not maybe the world's best word here, but anyway, this argument says that there exists something that is responsible for changes outside of itself, but is itself never changed. So it is responsible for other things being in motion or changing, but it itself is not caused to change. It just induces motion, but nothing gets it to induce motion. So its ability to be a mover is not received or derived from anything prior to it. So that's why God is not just a mover, but an unmoved mover. Unmoved mover. The second argument, I'm not always sure I understand how it's different from the first argument, but never mind that. This is the one that concludes that God is an uncaused cause. So you can see the similarity here. God exerts causation on other things, and in that way, God is a source for the being and reality of other things, but nothing exerts causation on God. God is not caused to be in any way. He's not caused to act in any way. The third argument is this famous and controversial argument about necessity and contingency. There's a lot of complications here. But the point that I want to focus on right now is merely this. According to this argument, everything other than God is contingent. It might not have existed. And the ultimate explanation of why it does exist is God. But God, by contrast, God exists necessarily. God exists and because of what God is, not because of a dependence on anything outside of God. God exists necessarily just because that's the way God is. The fourth way is the one that has that sort of Platonic look to it because it talks about gradations of things. And it actually talks about, it uses participation language. You thought Aquinas was against Plato, but there he uses participation language a lot more than you think. Once you notice it, then you start noticing it. So this is the fourth way. God has all perfections and doesn't get them from anywhere else, and everything else, whatever perfections or excellences that it has, it receives from the one who has them all in the highest degree, namely God. Okay, so again, I just want you to see the same pattern keeps coming up. And then the fifth way, shockingly un-Aristotelian argument, it depicts God as having knowledge in himself and guiding other things. So things, at least some, other things are guided by God's knowledge. But of course, God isn't guided by knowledge received from outside. Okay, so in all these cases, you get a similar structure. All the beings that we encounter in our experience need to have been derived from something outside of themselves. They depend on something outside of themselves. What they have within themselves is not adequate to explain the way they are or the fact that they are. And ultimately, this needs to be traced back to some being, some entity, some reality, which is not derived from anything else, which does not depend on anything else, and which is that thing that is the being that everything else depends on. So here's a sort of analogy. I wish I had a mirror here. I only thought of this a few minutes before and I couldn't think of one. But all of the things, think of light shining at you from a mirror, right? The light passes on, the mirror passes on the light, but it has to receive that light from somewhere else, and then it passes it on to you. Now, a mirror can reflect light that it received from another mirror. That's okay. But you can have 10 mirrors or 1,000 mirrors. It actually doesn't matter. But what you can't have is no light bulbs or no sun. There has to be something that produces light and doesn't merely reflect light. So God, in that way, is, in this analogy, God is like a light that produces light. He's like a light bulb. I mean, it sounds silly, but he's like a light bulb that produces light rather than just reflecting it. Or if you think of a truck There's the part that gets pulled, the trailer that gets pulled along, and then you have the part that's the engine. You can have a lot of trailers, one after the other. And the last trailer is pulled by the one before it, and it's pulled by the one before it. But you have to have a tractor. You have to have something with an engine at the beginning. Or here's a third analogy. You can be financially dependent on someone who is someone else, and that person can be financially dependent on a third person, and that person can be financially dependent on a fourth person. But eventually somebody has to actually have money. You can't just keep borrowing from borrowers. Now, you may think from reading the newspapers that what I'm saying isn't true, and I don't know how to explain this, except it makes me nervous. So, yeah, so somebody has to be independently wealthy on this analogy, and metaphysically speaking, that's what God is like. He's independently wealthy. Okay, that's a silly analogy, but okay, so that's the basic picture that I'm trying to sketch out. All right, now I want to move to the next section, which is about what an unsourced source must be like. So a source of other things, but it does not itself come from anywhere. And I think when you, and Aquinas' way of thinking, and this seems right to me, when you unpack this, when you unravel this, when you think this through, it turns out that if something's an unsourced source, it has to be infinitely perfect. But this is a difficult matter, but this is the idea that I have. So it's very easy to look at Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God, or to say things like God is the first unmoved mover, God is the uncaused cause, to say all of that stuff, and then almost immediately fall back and revert into sort of primitive ways of thinking. So God is this big old guy in the sky, and he has a giant beard, and yeah. So it's very hard not to immediately revert to such ways of thinking. But this can't be right. And so it turns out that on reflection, and here I mean philosophical reflection, that you don't need theology for this, I don't think. It turns out that God is different from everything else. God is very different from everything else. God is extremely different from everything else, shockingly different, astonishingly different. So if God is unsourced, that makes God prior or first in every possible order. Nothing is prior to God. Everything that exists is posterior to God. So one thing that follows from that is that God has no potentiality. If God had potentiality, then something could act on God and cause God to be actualized. He would be improved or enhanced by the actions of things outside of himself. But that can't be right, because then those other things would be a source for God's being. But no, God is the source of everything else. So God is completely actual on this way of thinking. And now here, this is another place where it's easy to start falling into inadequate modes of thinking. God is not completely actualized, because that suggests that he had potentiality, and that potentiality has been realized or actualized. So he's not actualized, he's just actual. He's completely actual, he's totally actual, and he's always already actual. I like using that phrase. It has that Heideggerian sound to it. God is always already completely and fully actual, in and of himself, not independent on anything else in any way. Now, the next step is the hardest step. I'll just sort of touch on it. Maybe it will come up later, maybe it won't. I think that for Aquinas, if God is totally actual, then he has to be unlimited. This is a difficult step. But I think for Aquinas, actuality is only limited when potentiality is involved. Let me say a little bit about, try to put some flesh on those bones, but this is a very difficult place in the argumentation. So because God is unsourced, because God is absolutely prior, he is a necessary being. He can't not exist. He can't be other than he is. So if he cannot not exist, if he exists necessarily, then he won't have within himself a composition of essence and existence. He won't be a kind of thing and also something that actually does exist. There's no distinction between those such that his actual existence is a realization or actualization of an essence. If he were composed in this way, then he would actually only be contingent. So then you'd have to start over because God isn't contingent, God is necessary. Otherwise, God wouldn't be first. Okay. So if this is right, then God's essence just is existence. It's to be. And there's no limitations. There's no types of being. God has all kinds of being. The argument goes something like this, it seems to me. If you find this difficult, well, so do I. Okay. So God's being first goes together with God's being infinite, unlimited. And so if he's unlimited, then he's not only the source of everything that actually exists, but he's also, there are other things which don't exist, but if they did exist, then God would be the source of them too. I paused because I almost said God is potentially the source of all those other things. Now, that's probably okay, but it sounds like that means God has potential, which isn't what I mean. I just mean that those other things could exist. And if they did, God would be the source of them too. So God has, I almost said it again. Whatever could be would come from God. Okay, well, this is a good point to pause and make a sort of second order remark. Our modes of thinking and our modes of speaking are all naturally best at talking about ordinary things in the created world, like squirrels or human beings or spoons or whatever. This is what we're good at thinking about. This is what we're good at talking about. But as I mentioned, God is very, 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 very different. Now, since that's the case, that means that our normal ways of thinking and our normal ways of talking don't apply very well to God. And so we have to modify them and adapt them. And I suppose this is controversial, but I think that from Aquinas's point of view, although we can modify them and adapt them, we cannot modify them and adapt them enough to really do full justice to what God is. And so that means whenever we say something, we have to say, well, that's sort of what it's like, but only in a way. It's similar to what's true, but not entirely. And there are places where Aquinas is discussing things, and then he'll say, oh, I'm sorry for saying it like that. It makes it sound like such and such, which is wrong. But then you think he's going to go, this is the correct thing to say. And he says, well, yeah, we're doing our best. So it's hard to get this right. There's a way of being lazy about this where you just say, look, God is a mystery. I'm not going to think hard. That's not good. I'm not recommending that. But if this way of thinking about God is correct, you should expect that your ways of thinking about God are always going to fall short of the full nature and actuality of what God is. And so that means that our concepts and our language are always going to be at least partly inadequate. And when you have that in mind, then you go look at Aquinas again. He says, in a way, and it's like this. He says stuff like that actually kind of a lot. You can start to tune it out after a while, but it's important not to. Okay, so we're doing our best. Now, so what do we have so far? God is the source of everything else, but he does not come from anywhere. He has no source. He's not derived from something or delivered from something, so he is unsourced. And from that, it somehow follows that he's infinite, that he has all possible modes of perfection. His being it encompasses all possible ways for there to be being. Now, I want to clarify 2 points. The first one is something that I've been a little bit vague about, not quite as vague as I was planning to be. But anyway, I have spoken up until now as if there were only one God, but I haven't actually said anything well, of course, I haven't said anything that proves there's only one God, but I haven't really even mentioned the fact that you should try to prove that. And it's a weird fact that if you look in the Summa Theologiae for a discussion of why there's only one God, you'll find it not in question 1, not in question 2, not in question 3. You'll find it in question 11. That's about 50 pages in. Now, up until then, of course, Aquinas is proceeding as if there's only one God. He doesn't, say there's one God, or maybe there's 100, I don't know, we'll see later, right? You can, of course, this is what he thinks, what he thinks, but it takes kind of a while to prove that there's only one God. That's a weird fact. But if you think about it, so think back to, like the arguments for the unmoved mover, right? What they really prove is that every moved mover has an unmoved mover. But that doesn't prove that the unmoved mover of you is the same as the unmoved mover of me. Maybe each of us has his or her own private unmoved mover. Now, Aquinas thinks he can solve this problem. I'm just pointing out that it actually isn't solved just by the proofs for the existence of God. It says the proofs are very cautious, and they only prove so much. So here's a way of thinking about it. Imagine that there were 2 gods. But of course, what we mean here is not 2 gods in the Aristotle sense, but 2 gods in the way that Aquinas thinks of them. So imagine that there were, and then we're going to see this leads to a problem. Okay, so there's 2 gods, suppose. Okay. Now, because God is what he is, this one is perfect, contains all possible perfections, and this one contains all possible perfections. Okay. Now, how could there ever be 2 things that are different from one another? Aquinas would say something like this: for 2 things to be different from one another, one of them has to have something that the other doesn't have. Or, the other one has to have something that the first one doesn't have. Otherwise, they would just be the same thing. So if I said, look, I have 2 pens here. One of them has a barrel, and this cap, and the other one also has this barrel and this. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? If that were the case, then it would just be 1 pen, right? Okay, so if there were 2 gods, one would have to have something that the other one doesn't. Well, this one has everything that's possible to have, and this one has everything that's possible to have. So it can't be that this one has something that this one doesn't have, or vice versa. It just cannot be. So that would mean that there could only be one. That's an argument of a Thomistic style. I think it's a pretty good argument, actually. But that's worth thinking about, and it's good to remember that the uniqueness of God is something that has to be treated separately. Okay. Second point, I have kept saying things like this: God has all the possible perfections, all the types of being, all the modes of being, all the excellences. But when you think about, it sounds like a beautiful thing to say. It sounds like something that actually needs to be true. But on the other hand, It should sound strange. So think of our old friend, the squirrel, Esquivo, right? So I hope I'm trying. So he's got a nice tail, okay? Now, if God has all the modes of being, does that mean that God has a tail? And of course, since he's God, it's a very big tail, and it's very shiny and very bushy. That seems crazy. We don't want to say this. Okay. So, no, of course, Aquinas doesn't say that. All right. But what should you say instead? This is the hard thing. Well, what Aquinas would say is that God, what Aquinas does say is that God has all perfections or all excellences in a higher mode, an eminent mode, in the highest mode. Okay, so that really does now sound like it's a very big, bushy tail. So that can't be right. So here's a way that I'm suggesting we can think about this. If you're a squirrel and you have a tail, the tail is some benefit to you. I'm not actually sure what squirrel tails are good for, but let's say it helps them to balance. When they're jumping from tree to tree, it helps, they use it to keep their balance. I think that's plausible. I've heard different theories, but let's say that, okay? So a squirrel's tail helps it to keep its balance. So that helps make it an effective agent. It's better at acting. Well, God, of course, being God, is an infinite agent. God is omnipotent. God can do absolutely anything. So whatever is beneficial to a squirrel about having a tail, God has that, not the tail, but what the tail is good for. In this case, we're supposing it's more effective agency. So if you're God, you are just a perfect agent. If you're a squirrel, well, you're not perfect, but you're trying to be the best you can. And one of the ways you can enhance and improve your agency is by having a tail. So having a tail makes you imitate God a little bit better. But what you, as it were, are trying to achieve is something that God has in its fullness without a tail, because he's so great, he doesn't even need a tail. So that's a way of trying to think about this without falling into the trap of supposing, that God has a big tail, because that can't be right. Okay. Good. Moving on. So hold on, let me take a drink of water. Okay. So God has all perfections in an eminent, highest way. Now, if that's right, then we can connect what's been said to points from earlier in these lectures. So, as you may recall, at the end of the second lecture, I said that you might feel unsatisfied with all the different theories of universals. You might think that Platonic universals are very strange and weird. You might think that the sort of more moderate kind of realism is also strange, because how could something be in multiple individuals at once? You might think that the moderate nominalist position is not really good enough, because saying that two things are just alike without any third thing to join them, that also, so you might just be, I don't know, I'm confused, something's wrong here. All right. Well, what if we bring God into the picture? What if we said that there was something that possessed all kinds or types of being, and this being had God, in other words, has all possible ways of being, and then all the other things that exist have those ways or modes of being in an imitative way, in a secondary way. They are similar to God in a lesser way, an inadequate way. So if you think like this, then you can say, aha, when I'm thinking about the problem of universals, I sort of want there to be a universal, some kind of kind. Well, what if that kind or nature was not something floating around like a Platonic individual or mysteriously existing in multiple things at once, but what if it was just an aspect of God's nature? God has all kinds of being, and one aspect or part, one partial aspect of what God is represented in an imperfect way by being a squirrel or being a rock or being a human being. So to be a human is to imitate God in a limited way. To be a squirrel is to imitate God in a different limited way, and so forth. So if you think of it like this, then some of what you might be looking for in a theory of universals, you could have it in your theory of God. Now, it's traditional to add the following. It's not only the case that God is imitated in various ways, it's also that God knows that he is imitated in various ways. If he has all perfections, of course, he's going to have knowledge, right? So he's going to know this fact. So he knows himself as imitable in all of these ways. He knows all the different ways in which he can be imitated. So then you could say, here's a traditional way of putting it, God has all these different ideas. He has the idea of himself as imitatable in the human way, or as imitable in the squirrel way, or whatever. So you could call these divine ideas. And then if you say that, then you could say that each creature is an imitation of or modeled on a divine idea. Okay, so and if you do enough additional work, there's a sense, even though each individual creature will have its own idea, you could also say that maybe in some sense there's a kind of generic divine idea for human or squirrel. This is a way you could try to see that divine ideas and aspects of God's nature can play the role of universals in your philosophy. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, I was afraid to accept universals or moderate nominalism because they both seemed like a lot to ask. It's a very demanding. So now you're asking me to accept God, like that's even more of a demand. But that wouldn't be, I don't think, quite the right way to do it. If you had already decided that God exists for different reasons, then you could say, I already have God in my system. I already have an infinite being. Now I can deploy this infinite being to solve other philosophical problems. But whether you could use this as an argument for God in the first place, that would be a lot harder. I admit that. Okay, so that is making the connection to the second lecture. Now I want to make a similar connection to the third lecture. And maybe you've already started guessing what I'm going to say if you were here for the third lecture. So in the third lecture, we talked about possibilities and we talked about possible worlds. And if you can believe in possible worlds, then it seems like you have an explanation of why many things are possible and how things could be different. But for some philosophers, the idea of possible worlds is something to be taken seriously, to really be believed in. It's a lot, it seems too much, they're too strange, they're very bizarre, too Platonic or whatever. So, so then I brought up the idea, a much more Aristotelian idea, that maybe what allows for possibility is not possible worlds, but instead agents with causal powers. So something is possible if it can be done. So it's possible for the cap of the pen to be removed if there is an agent who is able to remove it. Watch. So amazing. Okay, so that's why it was possible, because I am so powerful that I can do that. Okay. All right. So this seems like a nice, down to earth, sort of easy to accept explanation of possibility. But as we saw last week, there seem to be a lot of things that are possible, but it's not clear that there are agents that can bring them into being. So I gave the example. I still don't know whether it's a good example. It seems possible that you could have living organisms that are based on silicon rather than carbon, but it's not that obvious how you could get them. I don't know. I could be wrong about that. I'll change my example if I need to. Anyway, it's hard to resist the feeling that possibilities are wider than the range of agents that we have. And in truth, I think if you look at Aristotle, you'll see that for Aristotle, possibility isn't that wide. The kinds of animals and plants that we have, those are the only ones we're ever going to have. It can't be radically different. This is the world, this is the way it is. So I think that fits those two things, Aristotle's insistence on rooting possibility in causal powers of actual agents goes together nicely with his limited sense of what's possible. All right, well then, suppose that there were an agent that was infinitely powerful. Suppose there were an omnipotent agent. Some people believe in that. Aristotle doesn't, but Thomas Aquinas does. Now, if there were an agent like that, then you could have infinite possibilities, but they would be rooted in an agent. Everything that was internally consistent would be actually really possible because there actually is an agent who could cause them to come into being. Now, just for fun, I will give you a grand historical thesis. I don't know whether this is right, but it's fun to think about. It seems to me that in ancient philosophy, you have a limited range of possibility, and you have, in a sense, a limited God. And then in Christianity, you end up with this omnipotent God, an infinite God, and then you have an infinite range of possibility. And then sometime in the modern period, belief in God, especially belief in that kind of God, started to decline or to be removed from philosophy. But for some reason, people retained the idea of infinite possibility. So they had the idea that all things are possible, but they didn't have the God. And so if that's right, then that might explain why people have to come up with a theory of possible worlds or something like that, because they're trying to find an explanation of something. But maybe it would be more consistent if you had eliminated the Christian God to just go back to limited possibility. It was good enough for Aristotle. Maybe it should be good enough for us too, unless we believe in that omnipotent agent. So anyway, that's just a sort of grand historical thesis, hard to prove. Okay, just looking at the clock. All right, let me finish with one final little section. I said earlier that this way of thinking about God makes God seem very strange. God is so very different from anything that we've ever encountered. We can't, like literally speaking, can't imagine God, can't make a mental picture. Well, what I want to say in the end is that if this Thomistic way of thinking about God is the right way, then it turns out that creatures, everything created by God, creatures are strange too. And here's what I mean. I began these lectures by talking about substances. Remember, independent, unified particulars. And I started there because those are the most solid, the firmest beings that we encounter in our experience. And that's especially so because of their independence. They don't rely on other things. Other things rely on them. Other things depend on them. So like the color of the pen depends on the pen. However, it turns out, if Aquinas is right, that even substances are not fully independent. They are, all of them actually depend on God. They are all sourced from an unsourced source. So we thought that there were all of these light bulbs in the world, but it turns out they're not light bulbs, they're all mirrors. And this, I think, is a strange thing to think. It's not that Aquinas doesn't believe in substances, he does. It's just that he qualifies or modifies the sense in which they are independent and the sense in which they operate on their own. They do operate on their own within their own realm, but there's something outside of that realm that underwrites or undergirds or supports that whole realm. So everything that exists on Aquinas' way of thinking, everything that exists is received. Even the things that seem like they're just there, they too are received. Everything that we encounter, it actually has the nature that it really does. Aquinas says this is very important to him. Natures are real. Things are real. They really have their natures. But those things are received and their natures are received. So when you think about it like this, then in one way, everything stays the same. But in another way, everything seems very, very different. And it provokes a lot of deep reflection. Okay, so I'm done. Thank you very much for listening to these lectures and for sharing all of your questions and comments, which I'm looking forward to one more round of them. Yeah, metaphysics, it's very, very, very difficult. And it's one of really the hardest things that human beings can do. But Aristotle would say that we can do it better if we do it with other people. And so he says, with friends, we can better think and act. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that wonderful lecture. For sure and certain, I'm completely with you in everything you had to say in it. But I wonder if I could invite you just to talk a minute or two more, because I am slightly worried that somebody might come away from this thinking of God as the Force in the Star Wars movies.
Yeah.
So
Good.
Aquinas actually says, among our friends, we count God.
Yes, good. Okay. So
just to help me not worry that somebody might take away a wrong idea, if you could just
no, this is good. This is actually really good and really important. I might speak a little bit more than you're hoping I will, but let's see.
I will be grateful for all that you want to say, for sure.
Okay. So Aquinas likes to emphasize how different God is. That's all correct. However, he also likes to emphasize that God is not utterly 100% different. So he says that our language and thinking about God makes God analogous to things in this world. The words that we use and the concepts that we use for talking about God are not exactly the same as the ones that we apply to created realities, but they're not utterly different either. Now, one of the important ways in which this is true is that God is a person for Aquinas. Now, there's a complication because of the Holy Trinity. God, there are three divine persons, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. Okay. So God is personal. So God can think, God does think, God wills, God loves. All of these things are true. They're more true of God than they are of us. God is more of a thinker, more of a lover, and so forth than we are. So all of that stuff is also very important for Aquinas. Now, I think that in practice, there's a sort of difficulty. Because we are the way we are, we tend, so if we think about God as a person, that's good because it's true. But when we do so, we tend slowly to bring God down to our level. And he starts to seem a little bit like our uncle or our grandfather or some friendly person. And that's not completely wrong, but it's also not good enough because God is so much greater and so much higher. We're not like buddies with, I don't know what if that word translates for, never mind. We're friends with God, but it is an unequal friendship. Because of God being so much greater. So I think that in practice, we have to sort of go back and forth. For a while, you think about how amazing, you think about how God is close to you, God is like a person, and then you have to say, oh, wait, though. God is also infinite and transcendent. And then God starts to seem farther away and stranger. And that's true as well. But then if God becomes too far away and too strange in your thinking, then he just starts to seem like force or the laws of nature. And then God doesn't seem like a person anymore. So that's a mistake. So then you have to go back and start thinking about God as a person. Remember, before I said, I don't think we can think in a perfectly adequate way about God. So we have to sort of do it one way for a while and do it in another way. They're both true, but it's very hard to get them to hold them together in one thought. I don't know if that addresses your concerns, Professor Stump. Yeah.
It does for sure. It does, and I'm grateful to you for those very helpful remarks. So I won't take up any more of the
Well,
questions.
Aquinas worries about this very thing that we're talking about, and I think from his perspective, I'll just throw in two things briefly. He says that one of the reasons that the Bible is written in the way it is to make it easier for us to grasp things. So you can just speak about God's infinite power, but that's hard for us. So sometimes it says that God has a holy arm. Now, Christ, he doesn't actually like have an arm like with an elbow, okay? But like it's a way of thinking about God's power, and it makes it easier for us. And on top of that, Aquinas thinks that one of the reasons, now this is a specifically theological thing, this is not philosophy. One of the reasons that God becomes incarnate and becomes a human being in Jesus Christ is simply so that we can understand God better. So these are two ways in which, if you know what I mean, God is aware of God is aware of our cognitive challenges and tries to meet us halfway in these ways. So Aquinas does not advocate a sort of radical purification of our concepts in such a way that we would eliminate the Bible and stuff like that. He's not, so to speak, an iconoclast, because then it would be too difficult for us rational animals to actually know and love God.